Hey everyone, Vincenzo Calla here. Welcome to episode 6 of Let's Discuss Politics. Today I'm happy to be joined by the Ontario Green Party candidate for Beaches East York and the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario, Abhijit Mane. Abhijit moved to Canada when he was 14 from India, and he grew up from that age in Toronto and completed his honors Bachelor of Science at McMaster University and his master's in education at the University of Toronto. He works in learning and development at RENA, a nonprofit that works with people with developmental disabilities, where he designs and teaches courses. Abhijit Mane was elected the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario in 2018, and now he's running to be the next MPP for Beaches East York. Thank you, Abhijit, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Vincenzo. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here. I like to have on this show, I like to have people from so many different parties come in and share their thoughts. And it's great to have you, the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario, joining me today. So we're going to start our first segment, which is called Abhijit Story, where we'll talk about your political history. So the first question is, when did you first get involved in politics?
Yeah, so I was always interested in politics because, as maybe you know already from my website, my grandfather was a member of parliament back in India, in one of India's first parliaments post-independence from the British Empire. And so I was always interested in politics. So when I first came to Canada, I actually volunteered with my local MPP because I was so impressed by her. She was a Liberal. And so I worked, first volunteered and then worked for her campaign and then her Constituent office. And it was a really good learning experience about, what goes on behind in politics, essentially. But then I became sort of disillusioned by the Liberal Party, especially some of the things I saw happening at the federal level when, for example, Prime Minister Trudeau reneged on electoral reform. And so that's what made me leave the Liberal Party, and then that's how I ended up with the Greens.
Well, that's an interesting story for sure. I mean, going back, like your political story, like you're saying, started with your grandfather in India, and like so many different things that bring each person who's in politics to politics. It's such an interesting story because politics is sort of that a type of thing that brings people from all different walks of life to it, to represent people or want to run for different reasons that they may have.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why I joined the Greens was actually, again, back to my grandfather, because it comes full circle, because Mike Schreiner, who's the leader of the Ontario Greens, actually reminded me a lot of my grandfather, the same sort of genuineness, the same sort of sincerity and honesty in politics. And that's actually one of the biggest reasons why I joined the Ontario Greens.
Wow, that's interesting for sure. That's definitely interesting. So our next question is, why are you running for the position you want to hold, which is MPP for Beaches East York?
Yeah, so I was always interested in provincial politics more than federal or municipal, because I think it's like a political Goldilocks zone, where federal politics is very lofty and big ideas, and municipal politics is very detail oriented. So I find provincial politics to be a nice in between those two things. And obviously I was always interested in education and healthcare. So those are all the domains of provincial politics. So that's why I want to be an MPP, because I think we can make such a big change in provincial politics. And because we've seen what one Green MPP can do. We've already seen what Mike Schreiner has been doing in politics. We have an MPP who has actually, I think, might be the only independent MPP who's passed his own private members bill. And he did it by collaborating with all parties. And I think that's the kind of thing that Greens bring to the table. And I want to do the same. So if we can do all of that with one Green MPP, imagine what we can do with more, including me being part of the Green caucus, especially if we have a minority government next time around when the 2022 election comes.
Well, definitely 2022 is going to be very interesting to watch, because there's been so much that has happened in these past 4 years, more than has happened in so long. And it'll be very interesting to see how people in Ontario vote next time around. And lots of people, I'm sure, will be watching this in 2022 when the election comes around. People of Beaches East York. Hey, everyone from Beaches East York, if you're watching this. It's and like you said, like Mike Schreiner definitely is an inspiring individual since he got elected in 2018. I must say, I do like some of the stuff he has put forward since 2018. So that is interesting to see. And it'd be interesting to see what happens next time around, like you said. So the next segment is serving as an elected official, which is where we will talk about your goals to be an elected official. So the first question for this segment is, what is your favorite part about the community you want to represent, which is Beaches East York?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things I love about this community is that it still has that original feeling. So I came to Toronto, like I said, in 2005, and Toronto then and Toronto today is a very different thing, right? Like, but I still feel like, and actually, that was the area I landed in. I landed on the Danforth when I first came to Canada, and so it's basically, like it's old stomping grounds for me. I went to school in Danforth Collegiate, Danforth Tech, and so basically that community still has that old charm, the quirky little things that Toronto is so well loved for, I think still exists in Beaches East York. And that's what I love about it. Not to mention amazing restaurants, so many fantastic small businesses scattered across the riding, which are, very green in their ethos, right? So I really think it's a very cool and progressive, as well as just a very fantastic neighborhood to grow up in and to raise a family in.
Definitely small businesses, obviously they're the lifeblood of our communities, and especially like you mentioned, Beaches East York, you said there's so many of them there, and that's what keeps our communities alive, and especially recovering after the pandemic, that's what's going to bring our communities back to the way they once were and bring those initiatives back and all that sort of thing. So yeah. The next question is, what do you hope to achieve as an elected official if you're elected next year?
I think there's three main issues that I'm really passionate about. Technically, we have 5 things in our campaign platform, the 5 policies that I'm really passionate about. But the top one obviously is a very ambitious climate action, right? Like the climate crisis is upon us, as we're seeing across the world. And so we need to have ambitious goals set, because that's the only way that we're going to be mitigating some of the things that are coming our way that we can't change right now. So the best way to do is to lessen the blow by making those ambitious changes. The second one is to deal with the affordability crisis, especially in housing, because as young people, I'm much older than you, but I'm still in my 30s, and even my generation can't really afford to buy our own places in Toronto, and that is absolutely fundamentally unfair. And the third one being also the political system itself, I think needs fixing, and that means reforming our electoral process. So shifting towards something like proportional representation or mixed member proportional, something away from first past the post, because it's such a broken system, which leads to false majorities of 30-40% getting into power. So those 3 things, I think, are something that we need to fundamentally tackle. And then the last one also being the mental health crisis, as well as the recovery from COVID. Like you mentioned earlier, for small businesses, we need to make sure that they have the supports in place. And also for people, they have the supports in place to recover from the trauma of COVID-19.
Well, those are all great points that you brought up. I mean, especially young people not being able to afford a house. That's something that definitely in the federal election, we saw that, and that's going to have to come up in the provincial election as well from all parties. I hope that becomes a main issue, especially.
By the way, I just want to give a shout out to the Ontario Greens housing plan that we came out with, that the media called the best housing plan that has ever been released. So please go check that out. Just Google Ontario Green housing plan if you can.
Definitely, people, if you're watching this and you're interested in that, make sure to go look at that as well. And you talked about a bunch of good points, and I'm going to go on to the next question soon, but definitely, like you said, there's so many different issues that are hitting us, and especially during the federal election we saw with the electoral system and all that are all different things that probably should be taken a more serious look at nowadays, considering seeing how our world is changing, especially our political system, more systemic, not systemic voting, but yeah, I guess so, like strategic voting and that sort of thing. It's definitely something interesting that needs to be looked at more soon. So the last segment is called Politics Are All Around Us, where we will talk about the world of politics around us. So the first question for you is, who is or who was another politician that inspires you?
Yeah, so I have three. First one being my grandfather, as I mentioned, who was a very vocal advocate for people who belong to the so-called lower castes in India, as well as for the poor, urban poor especially. He helped build roads in the poorer sections of Mumbai. He also helped settle villages of people who had been ostracized because of their caste, and so basically said, "You go found your own village then." So he was a very strong proponent for justice. And then second being Mike Schreiner, the leader of Ontario Greens, who, like I mentioned earlier, is my inspiration for Ontario politics, and he's also my mentor. And I've learned so much from him in terms of how politics, especially the practical side of politics, works. And then thirdly is Bobby Kennedy, for young people may be watching this show who probably don't know who that is, but he was a very famous politician in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 70s actually. He was assassinated then. And the change that he made, because at first he was a very fervent, like anti-communist sort of crusader, but then later became this messiah for the needy and the poor. And so that kind of transition needs a lot of emotional heft, and I think that's what we need in politics as well.
Definitely strong voices are coming out of the woodworks finally, especially as I mentioned with my recent interview. More and more people are coming out, and people who usually aren't in politics are coming out and saying, hey, I'm tired of the way this is happening, especially in the past couple federal and provincial elections. People were tired of current governments, or tired of things that have been happening, or there hasn't been much focused on, which we'll go over in the next question shortly. And people just wanting to make a difference that usually aren't in politics. And that is very important, to come out and fight for what you believe in. So the last question is, what do you think is an issue that needs to be focused on more?
Yeah, my first instinct is always to say the climate crisis. I know that it's been in focus a lot more than it has in the past, but despite that, I think people still aren't showing the sort of urgency that is necessary. A lot of governments, even progressive parties like the NDP or the Liberals, say a lot of good words, but then don't really put that into action. Like just this past week, the NDP, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, announced that they wanted to subsidize gas by putting basically a floor, a cap on it. And that's just going to lead to more emissions. So you can't put a price on carbon and then subsidize carbon at the same time. So parties need to get really serious about this issue. And I think the more serious that we get, that all parties get on this. I was very encouraged by the fact that even the Conservative Party of Canada had put out a climate plan. So this is all because the Greens have been pushing for the climate action for the past 30 years. And I think finally we're getting some action, but I think we need a lot more.
That's definitely something that should be focused on more, that even I hope to see more of. A lot of parties in the past have used the environment and climate change sort of as a wedge issue, like, hey, look, we're using the buzzword sort of thing. And it's time for that to stop as a buzzword and actual action. Like you were saying, that is important, especially for all parties to take a strong stance on that. So that is all for today. Thank you, Abhijit, for joining me. If you like today's interview, make sure to check out my other interview with today's guest on Instagram for Top 5 and 5. If you're watching it at the premiere, it'll come out on Friday on Instagram. So to stay updated, make sure to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at VC Productions 25. Check out my website at vincenzocalla.com. Make sure to like, subscribe, and choose to get notifications here on YouTube. Let's Discuss Politics is a Calla production. So until the next video, I'm Vincenzo Calla, signing out.